Have you ever had absolute certainty about something, and sometime later he realized that it made absolutely no sense? Perhaps it happened during a conversation. You were explaining a subject with conviction, the words flowed easily, organized, almost elegant. Those listening even agreed. But deep down there was something strange there. A subtle feeling that the explanation was more beautiful than true. And yet you continued speaking. Confident. Convinced. Come. Now tell me, have you ever experienced this? Because if this has ever happened to you, stick with me until the end. What you're about to discover might surprise you, and perhaps make you a little uncomfortable too. There's something about how the human brain works that's rarely explained directly. A silent, automatic, almost invisible mechanism. When the brain encounters confusion, information gaps, or internal inconsistencies, it doesn't stop and say, "I don't know." It does something else. Something far more sophisticated and dangerous. It creates a narrative. Not a conscious lie. Not a story invented on purpose. But a sufficiently coherent narrative to hide the turmoil that's happening inside. Because turmoil hurts. Uncertainty breeds anxiety. And the brain, above all, seeks stability, predictability, control. Imagine a common situation. Someone asks you something unexpected. You don't have all the information, you don't remember the facts exactly, but you feel an immediate pressure to answer. The silence is unsettling. The doubt is unsettling. So, almost without realizing it, you connect fragments, fill in the gaps, organize loose ideas, and deliver an explanation that seems solid. Even to yourself. And here's the unsettling point. The more fluid the narrative, the greater the sense of truth. The brain isn't trying to deceive you. It's trying to protect you. To protect your identity, your image, your sense of understanding the world. Because admitting confusion threatens something very profound. The idea that you understand what's happening around you. Have you ever noticed how some stories make sense emotionally, even when they don't withstand closer scrutiny? How certain explanations seem to fit perfectly, despite having no real basis. This is no coincidence. It's the brain organizing internal chaos into meaning. And don't think this only happens in complex situations. This phenomenon appears in memories of the past, in strong opinions, in personal beliefs, in quick decisions, in judgments about people, in certainties that arise too quickly. Whenever clarity is lacking, the brain prefers a comfortable story to an uncomfortable void. Perhaps, as you listen to me now, you're thinking of someone who does this all the time. Or perhaps you're noticing something even more unsettling. You've done this more times than you realize. Notice how the mind clings to coherence. How it builds bridges between disconnected facts just to maintain a sense of understanding. How a good narrative soothes even when it's fragile. This isn't a character flaw. It's brain function. And it is precisely this type of strange, invisible, and profoundly human phenomenon that we explore here in Dark Human Science, not to offer easy answers, but to illuminate the inner workings of the mind where almost no one likes to look. Now, what makes all of this even more disturbing is realizing that these narratives don't just explain the world. They shape decisions, behaviors, and even memories. And most of the time they do so without asking permission. So take a deep breath. Because from here on out, we're going to delve a little deeper into this mechanism. We're going to understand why the brain prefers a good story to the harsh truth, and what that reveals about how you perceive reality itself. And perhaps, as all of this starts to make sense inside you, a memory is trying to emerge. A specific moment, a conversation, a decision, a certainty that seems strange today. If this is happening now, don't ignore it. This is your brain recognizing something that has always been there, but that is rarely observed directly. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below describing what has touched you the most so far. It could be a situation you've experienced, a memory that came back, or even that feeling that's hard to explain but impossible to ignore. When you write, you're not just telling your story, you're helping other people realize they're not alone in this strange experience of trying to understand their own minds. And if, at any point during this video, you felt that slight discomfort mixed with curiosity like the video, not as an automatic gesture, but as a signal that this type of content needs to continue existing. Each like tells the algorithm that it's worthwhile to take this conversation further, to people who may not even know they're trapped in narratives their own brains created. Now, if you feel that this type of reflection provokes you, unsettles you, and makes you look inward more attentively, subscribe to the channel. It's not about numbers. It's about building a space where this kind of deep, human, and often uncomfortable questioning can continue to happen. Your subscription shows that you want to continue exploring these inner workings of the mind with us. This channel grows like this. When real people share real experiences, when curiosity overcomes the fear of confusion, when a community forms around the desire to understand, not just the brain but oneself. And now that you've realized that the mind prefers a good story to the silence of doubt, the next question almost arises on its own. What happens when these narratives begin to guide choices, emotions, and memories without us even realizing it? That's exactly where this journey begins to get even deeper. When confusion arises, it doesn't make a sound. It creeps in. It emerges as a vague feeling, a small internal noise, a discomfort difficult to name. And the brain perceives this long before you formulate any conscious thought. For it, confusion is not just a lack of information. It's a threat. It's instability. It's a sign that something has gone wrong. The human brain was shaped to seek predictability. Since our earliest ancestors, understanding the environment meant survival. Knowing what was happening, recognizing patterns, anticipating consequences. Uncertainty has always been associated with danger. That's why, even today, the brain reacts to confusion as if it were facing something that needs to be corrected immediately. Confusion breeds anxiety. It generates tension. It generates that uncomfortable feeling of not being in control of the situation. And, perhaps the most delicate point of all, confusion threatens identity. Because the way you see yourself is directly linked to the idea that you understand the world, understand yourself, understand your choices. When that foundation begins to tremble, something very deep is activated. It is at this exact moment that the brain makes a silent decision. He could stop. He could maintain the "I don't know." He could accept doubt as part of the process. But that comes at an emotional cost. The emptiness of uncertainty is too uncomfortable. So he chooses another path. A brilliant path from an adaptive standpoint, and a dangerous one from the standpoint of truth. He fills it in. When data is lacking, it creates connections. When logic fails, it builds coherence. When understanding doesn't come, it produces meaning. It doesn't matter if that meaning is accurate. What matters is that it's sufficient to relieve internal tension. The brain prefers a wrong explanation to no explanation at all. Because confusion hurts more than being wrong. This is the hidden truth that we rarely face. Being wrong still preserves a narrative. It still keeps a story going. Confusion, on the other hand, dismantles everything. It exposes gaps, weaknesses, deep doubts. It forces the brain to admit that it doesn't know. And admitting that it doesn't know, for the mind, is losing territory. Therefore, when faced with uncertainty, the brain does not seek the truth. It seeks relief. And this relief comes in the form of an internal narrative that organizes the chaos. A story that explains, that justifies, that connects loose ends. Even if those ends never belong to the same timeline. Even if the explanation is fragile. Even if the logic is built on assumptions. What's most striking is that, once this narrative takes shape, it is defended with fervor. Not because it's true, but because it fulfilled its emotional function. It reduced anxiety. It restored a sense of control. It rebuilt a momentarily shaken identity. And this is where a lot of things start to make sense. Why are so many decisions made with such conviction, only to later seem inexplicable? Why do people hold on to versions of events that clearly don't hold up? Why do certain beliefs resist contrary evidence? Because these narratives were born not from the search for truth, but from the need to escape confusion. The brain isn't interested in precision. It's interested in stability. This directly impacts how you make decisions, how you interpret the past, how you project the future, how you build your mindset when facing challenges. In moments of uncertainty, the brain quickly chooses a story that makes emotional sense, and from there guides behaviors, choices, and reactions. This is a silent journey that takes place behind the scenes of the mind. A journey where narrative comes before understanding, where comfort comes before clarity, where emotional impact outweighs cold logic. And perhaps you're realizing now that many of your certainties were born precisely like that. Not from deep analysis, but from an unconscious attempt to avoid the discomfort of not knowing. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. The problem is that, when these narratives accumulate, they begin to shape how you perceive reality. They influence important decisions. They affect relationships. They direct life choices. They create internal truths that are rarely revisited. And the longer a narrative remains active, the harder it becomes to question it. Because questioning it means returning to the original point, confusion. And the brain resists that with all its might. There's something almost paradoxical here. That which should bring us closer to the truth, doubt, is seen by the brain as an enemy. And that which distances us from the truth, a comfortable story, is seen as a solution. This silent inversion happens every day in small and large decisions without us even realizing it. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. because understanding this mechanism completely changes how you observe your own reactions, your certainties, and even your internal conflicts. When you begin to see how the brain deals with confusion, you start to notice subtle signs. The impulse to respond quickly, the discomfort when questioned, the emotional defense of certain ideas, the feeling of "this makes sense," even when something doesn't quite fit. These signs reveal much more than they seem. They show the exact point where the narrative kicked in, where the mind chose meaning over truth, where anxiety was silenced but at the cost of clarity. And it is at this point that the most uncomfortable revelations begin, because realizing this in oneself requires courage. It requires tolerating, even if only for a few seconds, the emptiness of uncertainty. It requires facing the confusion without immediately fleeing into a ready-made story. If all of this resonated with you, write a simple sentence in the comments: "That makes sense to me." When the brain realizes it doesn't have enough data, it doesn't visibly panic. It doesn't sound an alarm saying, "Danger, we don't know." What happens is much quieter, much more elegant, and precisely for that reason much harder to perceive. Faced with a lack of information, the brain activates an automatic organizational mechanism. It begins to construct a story. Not a random story, but a narrative coherent enough to restore a sense of meaning. That's the trick. When data is lacking, the brain invents connections. It fills gaps with plausible assumptions, reorganizes memory fragments, adjusts perceptions, and fits emotions. All of this happens too quickly for you to notice the process. The end result arrives ready-made. An explanation that seems logical, an interpretation that seems obvious, a conclusion that sounds correct. And, above all, a feeling of relief. It's not about deceiving others. It's about calming down. The human mind cannot tolerate an explanatory void. The silence of doubt generates tension. The absence of meaning provokes instability. So the brain prefers to create something imperfect rather than sustain nothingness. A false explanation is better than none. Coherence matters more than truth. These sentences are not an exaggeration. They accurately describe how this mechanism works. Do you see how this changes everything? The narrative doesn't arise from the search for reality, but from the need to reduce emotional discomfort. The brain wants to close the circuit. You want to finish the story. You want to reach a final point, even if that point is built on fragile assumptions. Because a fragile plot is still more comfortable than an open question. This process is so automatic that you often confuse narrative with comprehension. You feel you understand something when in reality you've only organized insufficient information in a way that seems to make sense. The feeling of clarity comes before actual clarity. And this feeling is powerful. It creates confidence. It generates conviction. It gives the impression of mastery over the situation. This is how important decisions can be made based on internal stories, not on solid facts. This is how hasty judgments are formed. This is how mindsets are built from incomplete interpretations. And this is how many hidden truths remain concealed, buried under narratives that work emotionally but don't withstand deeper scrutiny. Behind the scenes of the mind, the brain is always trying to maintain a continuous line. It hates holes in the story. It hates interruptions. It hates contradictions. When something doesn't fit, it adjusts whatever is necessary to preserve overall coherence. Sometimes it adjusts facts. Sometimes it adjusts memories. Sometimes it adjusts its own perception of reality. And the more emotionally charged the situation, the stronger the narrative created. Intense emotions accelerate this process. Fear, shame, guilt, pride, the desire to belong, all of these fuel internal stories that explain the world in a way that protects identity. It doesn't matter if that explanation is true. What matters is that it's functional. This mechanism has a direct impact on personal transformation. Because if you don't realize when a narrative is created to soothe you, you end up living within it. It begins to guide choices. It defines reactions. It sustains beliefs. It shapes decisions. And over time, it ceases to be perceived as an interpretation and begins to be treated as objective reality. Perhaps that's why certain conversations seem impossible. Each person isn't defending facts, but narratives that emerge to reduce confusion at different points in their journey. Questioning someone else's narrative sounds like a threat, because deep down it is. The narrative doesn't just protect an idea. It protects the internal stability of the person who constructed it. The most curious thing is that the brain feels rewarded when it manages to close a story. There's a sense of completion, of understanding, of restored order. This reinforces the behavior. The more times a narrative works to alleviate discomfort, the faster the brain resorts to it again. The pattern becomes consolidated. The mind learns that creating stories is an efficient way to deal with uncertainty. And so we continue, often believing that we understand much more than we actually do. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a silent side effect in this process that's rarely discussed. When consistency becomes more important than truth, something starts to change in how you react to the world. You start defending narratives instead of exploring questions. You start protecting explanations instead of investigating gaps. You start confusing mental comfort with real clarity. This shift happens slowly, almost imperceptibly, but the impact is profound. It influences how you deal with conflict, how you interpret mistakes, how you react to information that challenges your beliefs. The narrative becomes a filter. Everything that confirms is accepted. Everything that threatens is rejected or distorted. And here arises an uncomfortable question. How many of your certainties exist because they are true, and how many exist because they work emotionally? This question doesn't seek an immediate answer. It opens up space. It creates a small fissure in the narrative. And it is precisely in this fissure that something new can emerge. Not a new, ready-made story, but the possibility of observing the very workings of the mind in action, of seeing behind the scenes, of perceiving when the brain is more concerned with calming itself than with understanding. This realization is not comfortable, but it is transformative. Because, from that point on, confusion ceases to be the absolute enemy and becomes a sign. A warning that something is still unclear. An invitation to pause before filling the void with any available explanation. And it is at this point in the journey that the revelations begin to take shape, when you realize that perhaps the greatest challenge is not dealing with the lack of answers, but learning to sustain questions without immediately rushing to a story that seems good enough. If this reflection resonated with you, write in the comments, "I'm on this journey too." This process doesn't begin dramatically. There's no clear moment when the brain announces it's about to create a narrative. Everything happens below the line of consciousness, behind the scenes. First comes the lack of information. Something is incomplete. A piece of data is missing, a memory is vague, an explanation doesn't quite fit. Sometimes this arises in a simple conversation, sometimes in an important decision, sometimes in an old memory that returns without all the details. The mind perceives the gap, even if you haven't yet realized it. Then, almost immediately, a feeling of confusion arises. It's not an elaborate thought, it's a state. A slight internal misalignment. Something like when you enter a room that's too dark and your eyes haven't adjusted yet. It doesn't hurt, but it's unsettling. It's a feeling of disorganization, that the pieces don't fit together. And the brain, which is always looking for patterns and continuity, identifies this as a problem to be solved. This confusion triggers emotional discomfort. Here the process gains momentum. Because the discomfort is not just cognitive, it's physical, visceral. It can manifest as mild anxiety, restlessness, irritation, a rush to respond, a need to finish. It is at this point that identity begins to be affected. The idea of "I know, I understand, I am in control" suffers a small crack. And the brain doesn't like cracks. Then he reacts. Without asking permission, without warning, without internal debate, the brain begins to create a plausible story. It searches through memories, past experiences, existing beliefs, associated emotions. It picks up pieces from here and there and assembles something that seems coherent. It doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to make enough sense to fill the gap. This story is born quickly, fluidly, with a beginning, middle, and end. And most importantly, it rings true. At that moment, something decisive happens. The narrative brings relief. The tension decreases. The discomfort dissipates. The feeling of control returns. The brain breathes. And you feel it as clarity, as understanding, as certainty. The cycle closes. Lack of information, confusion, emotional discomfort, creation of a plausible story, a feeling of relief. All this happens in seconds. And here's the most important revelation. This process is not conscious. The person isn't lying. They aren't deliberately making it up. They truly believe the story that just emerged. Because for the brain, that narrative isn't a hypothesis, it's an emotional solution. Questioning it would mean reopening the wound of confusion. And that's something it avoids at all costs. Perhaps now you are recognizing something familiar. A moment when you explained something without being absolutely sure. A memory you always recounted the same way, even without knowing if the details were exactly as described. A decision that, at the time, seemed obvious but today sounds strange. This internal trigger, "This has happened to me before," is the sign that you are seeing the mechanism in action. The brain is incredibly skilled at transforming interpretations into subjective facts. Once a narrative is formed, it integrates into a person's mindset. It begins to influence new decisions. It serves as a basis for future judgments. It is used as a reference point for interpreting other situations. And the more times it is accessed, the more solid it seems. Repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity creates a sense of truth. Behind the scenes, the mind is always trying to maintain a continuous narrative thread. A coherent personal journey, where everything seems to have a reason, a cause, a logic. Even when reality is chaotic, ambiguous, or incomplete, the narrative acts as psychological glue. It holds everything together, even if the material is fragile. This process has a profound impact on how you deal with revelations. When new information emerges that threatens the existing narrative, discomfort returns. And the brain once again kicks in. Sometimes it adjusts the new information to fit the old story. Sometimes it rejects it completely. Sometimes it distorts details. All to preserve internal coherence. Coherence matters more than truth. That's why profound changes require more than just new data. They require navigating the discomfort of confusion. They require sustaining for a time the feeling of not knowing. And that goes against the brain's automatic impulse. It goes against years of conditioning. It goes against the constant search for immediate relief. This is a silent but transformative journey. Because when you begin to understand how narratives are born, you gain a small space between stimulus and response. A space where you can observe the confusion without immediately filling it in. Where you can feel the discomfort without rushing to a ready-made story. Where you can allow the truth, even incomplete, to have more space than a comfortable explanation. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a specific moment when this process becomes even more powerful and more invisible. A point where the narrative not only explains but begins to protect emotions, justify choices, and shape how you see yourself and others. It is at this point that the impact is amplified and decisions begin to be guided almost entirely by internal stories. When you understand this, something changes in how you observe your own reactions. You begin to notice when an explanation comes too quickly. When certainty arrives without investigation. When irritation arises when questioned. These signs reveal the exact moment when the narrative kicked in to hide the original confusion. And realizing this isn't comfortable. But it's revealing. Because from there you can choose. Not choose absolute truth, but choose to remain a little longer in the space of doubt. And that space, however uncomfortable it may be, is where true understanding begins to form. If this part of the reflection resonated with you, write in the comments, "This has happened to me before." Perhaps now all of this is becoming less abstract and closer to everyday life. Because this mechanism doesn't live hidden in complex theories or laboratory experiments. It manifests itself all the time in the most common, most human, most banal situations. That's precisely why it goes unnoticed. It blends into routine, conversations, memories, and the certainties we carry without questioning. Think about memories from the past. How many stories from your life do you always tell the same way? Childhood moments, important decisions, old conflicts, relationships that ended. When you revisit these memories, they seem organized with a beginning, middle, and end. But if you stop to observe carefully, you'll notice gaps. Details that no longer exist. Emotions that may have been adjusted over time. The brain doesn't like confused memories. So it edits. It softens. It dramatizes. It creates a narrative that explains who you were, why something happened, who was right, who was wrong. Not to lie, but to maintain a coherent story about yourself. Now observe the discussions. Those debates where someone speaks louder, faster, with more conviction. Sometimes that person doesn't have more information. They have a more solid narrative. They win by shouting not because they are right, but because their internal story is so well organized that it leaves no room for doubt. Questioning that explanation generates immediate irritation. Not because the argument was attacked, but because emotional stability was threatened. The narrative served to calm things down. Taking that away hurts. And what about strong beliefs without a clear basis? Ideas that someone defends tooth and nail, but whose origins they can't explain. It's always been this way. I feel it's true. This makes sense to me. These phrases are clues. They reveal narratives born to fill voids, to bring order to confusing experiences, to create a sense of belonging or security. The strength of belief doesn't come from evidence, it comes from the relief it provides. Improvised explanations are perhaps the most subtle example. Someone asks something unexpected. There's no time to reflect. The brain kicks in. An answer emerges, fluid, convincing, full of the right words. The listener believes it. The speaker believes it even more. But if someone asks for more detail, something starts to go wrong. The story wasn't meant to be explored. It was designed to quickly close the feeling of confusion. And at that moment it worked. You've probably found yourself in one of these situations. Maybe all of them. And that doesn't say anything negative about you. On the contrary, it says that your brain is doing exactly what it was trained to do: protect you from internal discomfort. The problem isn't creating narratives. The problem is confusing them with absolute reality. This is a crucial point in the journey. Because when you begin to recognize these examples in your daily life, something changes in the way you observe your own reactions. You start to notice when a memory seems too organized, when an explanation comes too quickly, when a certainty is based more on emotion than on facts. This doesn't invalidate your experience, but it opens up space for a more honest investigation. This is what we explore here on Dark Human Science. Not just the strange phenomena of the brain, but those invisible backstage processes that shape decisions, beliefs, and identities without us even realizing it. It is in this territory that transformation begins, not as a dramatic rupture, but as a fine-tuning of the way we look inward. These examples show how narrative acts as a lens. It filters reality. It highlights some aspects, erases others, rearranges events so that everything makes sense within a continuous story. And the more times this lens is used, the more natural it seems. There comes a point where you no longer realize you are looking through it. You believe you are seeing the world as it is. But all it takes is an unexpected situation, a question off script, a piece of information that doesn't fit, for the confusion to reappear. And the cycle begins again. Lack of information, emotional discomfort, the creation of a new story. Sometimes the old narrative is adjusted. Sometimes a new one emerges on top. The mind is extremely flexible when the goal is to preserve coherence. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a level where these narratives cease to be merely specific explanations and begin to structure how you make important decisions. They influence career choices, relationships, moral stances, worldview. They create mental shortcuts that save energy but exact a silent price. Distance from the rawest, most ambiguous, most complex truth. When you realize this, an uncomfortable but powerful question begins to emerge. How much of my journey was guided by facts? And how much was guided by stories I needed to believe in order to move forward? This question doesn't demand an immediate answer. It demands space, observation, internal honesty. And it is precisely in this space that something begins to transform. Not because you abandon all narratives, but because you begin to recognize them as constructs, tools, not absolute truths. This recognition changes the mindset. It makes decisions more conscious. It opens space for revisions. It reduces rigidity. It increases curiosity. If you recognized yourself in any of these everyday situations, write in the comments, "That makes sense to me." There's a silent side effect in this process that almost no one notices while it's happening. It doesn't appear abruptly, nor does it immediately draw attention. On the contrary, it disguises itself as something positive. After the narrative is established and emotional relief appears, a powerful feeling is born alongside it: trust. Not the trust built on deep understanding, but a superficial, quick, seductive trust. The trust of someone who believes they understand, even without having understood. This is where the danger begins. When a narrative is formed to hide confusion, it doesn't come alone. It brings with it an untested certainty. A conviction that hasn't been investigated. A sense of clarity that wasn't built on solid evidence. This false certainty is extremely convincing because it arises alongside emotional relief. The brain associates the story with the end of discomfort, and this reinforces the belief that the explanation is correct. The mind begins to confuse tranquility with truth. And from that moment on, something changes in the way new information is received. Any data that confirms the narrative is quickly accepted, almost as a positive reinforcement. Anything that challenges the story, however, causes discomfort. A discomfort that vaguely recalls the original confusion. And the brain reacts in the same way as before. It tries to protect the newly acquired stability. Then resistance arises. Not a conscious, rational, declared resistance, but an emotional resistance. A subtle closure. An automatic, "this doesn't make sense." An impulse to discredit the source, disqualify the argument, change the subject. Not because the new information is necessarily false, but because it threatens to dismantle the narrative that brought relief. Questioning the story means reopening the wound of uncertainty. And the brain instinctively avoids this. At this point, the narrative ceases to be merely an explanation and becomes a defense. It protects not only an idea but also the feeling of control, the identity, the mindset built around that story. The person begins to defend the narrative as if they were defending themselves. Any attack on the story is felt as a personal attack. And this generates intense, disproportionate, emotional reactions. This is the emotional defense of one's own history. You've probably seen this happen before. Maybe you've even experienced it yourself. A simple conversation that quickly turns into an argument. An innocent question that generates irritation. A different suggestion that is received as a threat. In these moments, it's not about who is right. It's about the internal stability that the narrative sustains. The more confused the origin, the more rigid the belief. This sentence sums up the problem with uncomfortably precise accuracy. When a narrative is born from a large gap, a profound lack of information, an intense moment of emotional turmoil, it becomes especially resilient. Because dismantling it would mean confronting not just a mistake but a void. And a void is frightening. Over time, this trust without understanding begins to shape important decisions. Career choices are made based on internal narratives about who I am or what is possible for me. Relationships are maintained or broken based on interpretations that are never revised. Rigid positions are adopted without openness to review. The narrative begins to guide the journey, while reality takes a back seat. The impact of this is profound. The person feels they know but can't explain it. They feel they are right but can't substantiate it when questioned. And yet, the certainty remains. Because it doesn't depend on logic, it depends on the emotion that sustains it. That's the trap. The more the narrative fulfills its emotional function, the less need the brain feels to revise it. And that's precisely why this side effect is so dangerous. It creates the illusion of maturity, conviction, and clarity. But beneath that surface lies fragility. There is rigidity. There is a fear of questioning. Because questioning can mean dismantling something that holds everything together. This mechanism also explains why profound changes are so difficult. It's not just resistance to the new. It's protection of the old. The old narrative offers security. Even if it limits, even if it distorts, even if it prevents growth. Letting go of it requires courage to go through the confusion, the discomfort, the feeling of not knowing again. It requires enduring a period without ready answers. And few people have been taught how to do that. We live in a culture that values quick answers, firm opinions, clear certainties. Little space is given to honest doubt, slow investigation, or the suspension of judgment. The brain learns early on that it is better to appear confident than to admit confusion. And so, narratives accumulate, one on top of the other, creating a rigid structure that looks like identity, but is often just defense. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a point where this trust without understanding starts to generate even more subtle consequences. It not only blocks new information, but distorts how reality is perceived. The narrative becomes a filter. Everything passes through it. What confirms is amplified. What threatens is minimized. What doesn't fit is ignored. At this stage, the person doesn't feel like they're avoiding the truth. They feel like they're being consistent. And this feeling of consistency is extremely powerful. It brings stability, predictability, identity. But it also reduces flexibility, curiosity, and openness. The journey becomes narrower. Possibilities diminish. Transformation slows down. Realizing this about yourself is uncomfortable. It generates a certain fear. A dread of discovering that some certainties were built on unstable ground. But it also generates awareness. And awareness, even when it hurts, expands. It creates space. It allows for choices more aligned with real understanding, not just emotional comfort. This is a delicate point in the journey. Because it doesn't ask you to abandon everything you believe in. It only asks you to observe. To recognize when a certainty is sustained by understanding, and when it is sustained by emotional need. This distinction changes everything. It changes the mindset. It changes the decisions. It changes the way you relate to your own hidden truth. And when this perception begins to form, something is about to happen behind the scenes of the mind. A subtle but profound shift that opens the way to seeing not only the narratives, but what happens when they begin to fail. If this reflection resonated with you, write in the comments, "That makes sense to me." There's a very comfortable myth that needs to be carefully dismantled. The idea that this type of mental trap only affects uninformed, naive, or unintelligent people. As if intelligence were a kind of immunity against false narratives. As if thinking well meant never falling for mental shortcuts. This belief is tempting, and completely wrong. This has nothing to do with intelligence. It has to do with how the brain works. The brain of an intelligent person is no less vulnerable to confusion. It feels the same discomfort in the face of uncertainty, the same anxiety when data is lacking, the same need to restore internal coherence. The difference lies in the repertoire. The greater the cognitive capacity, the greater the ability to construct sophisticated narratives. More elaborate, more articulated stories, more difficult to dismantle. Intelligent people don't create fewer narratives. They create better narratives. They use logic, vocabulary, references, analogies. They connect distant points. They give explanations that sound profound. And this generates a powerful illusion, the feeling that, because the explanation is complex, it must be true. But complexity is not synonymous with precision. Often, it is merely a sign of cognitive creativity applied to calm the mind. Intelligence provides the tools. The brain decides how to use them. When an intelligent person encounters confusion, the process is the same. Lack of information, emotional discomfort, a need to close the story. The difference is that the closure comes with more layers. The narrative gains more refined justifications, more elegant connections, arguments that seem solid. This makes the mistake more convincing, more resistant to questioning, more integrated into the identity. Intelligence doesn't prevent error, it only makes error more convincing. This phrase is unsettling because it dismantles an important psychological defense, the belief that, if I thought about it enough, it must be right. The problem is that thinking a lot doesn't guarantee you thought in the right direction. Often you've simply constructed a nicer story to hide a gap that was never filled. This phenomenon frequently appears in intellectually demanding environments. Complex debates, strategic decisions, in-depth analyses. The greater the pressure for answers, the faster the intelligent brain kicks in to produce meaning. And the more sophisticated the narrative, the less likely anyone is to question it, including the author of the story himself. There's a delicate point here. Intelligent people often identify with their own capacity for understanding. Identity is strongly linked to I understand. When this identity is threatened by confusion, the reaction is intense. The narrative not only protects from discomfort, it protects self-image. Questioning the story begins to sound like questioning one's own worth. This explains why brilliant people often prove extremely resistant to new information. Not due to a lack of ability, but due to an excessive emotional investment in the existing narrative. The more time, energy, and identity have been placed in that explanation, the greater the psychological cost of abandoning it. Behind the scenes, the intelligent brain does something very efficient. It rationalizes. It finds motives, creates secondary explanations, adjusts details, all to keep the main story intact. It's not dishonesty. It's self-protection. It's the same basic mechanism operating with more advanced tools. This process has a direct impact on mindset. The person begins to trust their own interpretation more than external reality. They start to believe that disagreement is ignorance, that questioning is an attack, and that doubt is weakness. And, without realizing it, they close important doors to transformation. The journey to true understanding requires something that intelligence alone cannot guarantee: cognitive humility. The ability to say, maybe I don't know. The willingness to endure confusion without immediately filling the gap. The courage to leave a question open, even when you have the ability to come up with a quick answer. And that's difficult precisely for those who think clearly. The more agile the brain, the faster it produces stories. The more creative, the easier it is to connect the dots. The more knowledge, the greater the repertoire to justify anything. The danger lies not in a lack of intelligence but in overconfidence in it. This is a key point of awareness. Because when you realize that intelligence doesn't automatically protect you, something changes in the way you observe your own thoughts. You begin to distrust explanations that arise too quickly. You start to wonder where that certainty came from. What discomfort is it hiding? What confusion was silenced so that narrative could exist? This awareness doesn't diminish intelligence. On the contrary, it matures it. It takes the mind off autopilot. It creates space for choices that are more aligned with real understanding, not just mental comfort. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a specific moment when even the most sophisticated narratives begin to show cracks. A point where reality insists, despite explanations, despite justifications, despite well-constructed logic. And it's at this point that something very interesting happens. The brain is forced to deal with the confusion in a different way. This moment is not pleasant. It generates tension. It generates insecurity. It generates that feeling that something doesn't add up, even when everything seems to make sense on paper. But it is precisely there that the most important revelations of the journey begin. When the narrative can no longer hide the emptiness that lies behind it. Recognizing this point requires something rare: the willingness to observe one's own thinking in action, without immediately clinging to the narratives it creates. It's a subtle shift in internal posture, but one with a profound impact on how you perceive decisions, beliefs, and the very hidden truth that guides many of your actions. If this part made you think, write in the comments, "I'm on this journey too." There's a very specific moment when everything starts to change. It's not a big shock, nor a cinematic revelation. It's more subtle than that. It's when you begin to realize the signs small, repetitive, almost invisible. And from there, something shifts in the way you observe your own mind. That's the turning point. Because the brain doesn't announce when it's creating a narrative to hide confusion. It leaves clues. One of the most common problems is explanations that are too long. When someone, or even you, starts explaining something in excessive detail, full of detours, examples, and parallel justifications, the story seems rich, elaborate, even interesting. But if you listen carefully, you realize that it doesn't go deep. It skirts around the issue. It revolves around a core that is never directly addressed. The more words, the less clarity. It's the brain trying to maintain coherence without a solid foundation. The narrative grows because the understanding is shallow. Another strong sign appears when anger arises upon being questioned. Not a quiet disagreement, but an immediate, almost automatic irritation. Someone asks a simple question, "Why? How do you know? Where does this come from?" And something ignites inside. The tone changes. The emotion rises. The conversation ceases to be an exchange of ideas and becomes a defense. This doesn't happen because the question is offensive, but because it threatens to dismantle the story that brought relief. Questioning the narrative is to reopen the original confusion. And the brain reacts as if it were being attacked. Overly quick certainty is also an important sign. That answer that comes instantly, without hesitation, without pause, without room for doubt. In some cases, speed comes from real experience. But, in many others, it comes from the urgency to close the matter. The brain didn't want to explore possibilities, didn't want to investigate nuances. It chose the first plausible story and clung to it. The speed of certainty doesn't come from clarity, it comes from the need to end the discomfort. And perhaps one of the most revealing signs is the profound discomfort with phrases like, "I don't know." For many people, saying "I don't know" sounds almost unbearable. It seems like weakness. It seems like a loss of status. It seems like a personal failure. When someone utters these words, something tightens. The brain feels like the ground disappears for a moment. Because "I don't know" keeps the confusion open. It doesn't close the story. It doesn't bring immediate relief. That's why it prefers any answer to that. When you start noticing these signs, something curious happens. You begin to see the mechanism in real time. In the middle of a conversation, in the middle of a decision, in the middle of a thought. That urge to over-explain arises. That sudden irritation. That quick certainty. That discomfort with doubt. And, instead of acting automatically, you notice. This moment of realization is transformative. Not because you suddenly have all the answers, but because you gain a small space between impulse and action. An interval where you can choose not to immediately fill the void. Where you can sustain the confusion for a few more seconds. Where you can observe the narrative forming, almost like a spectator of your own mental backstage. This space changes your mindset. It reduces rigidity. It weakens automatic emotional defenses. It allows for more conscious decisions. Because when you realize that a certainty was born to soothe, not to explain, you can treat it with more caution. You don't need to discard it, but you also don't need to defend it as absolute truth. This perception has a direct impact on your personal journey. It affects how you deal with conflict, how you react to criticism, how you revise old beliefs. You begin to notice when a discussion isn't about facts, but about emotional protection. When an explanation serves more to maintain one's identity intact than to understand reality. And this applies to you as well as to others. The most interesting thing is that, at this point, the confusion changes role. It ceases to be an immediate enemy and becomes a signal. A warning that something is still unclear. An invitation to investigate instead of concluding. A fertile ground for deeper revelations. Sustaining the confusion for longer is not comfortable, but it is honest. And inner honesty is what paves the way for real understanding. This is a rare lesson. Because almost everything around us encourages quick answers, firm opinions, well-packaged certainties. Little is said about the value of pausing, of conscious doubt, of internal observation. But that's exactly where transformation happens. Not in the accumulation of new stories, but in the ability to perceive when a story is being created to hide something that hasn't yet been understood. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because recognizing the signs is only the beginning. There is a next, more delicate step which involves what happens when you choose not to reinforce the automatic narrative. When you allow the confusion to linger longer. When you begin to question not the external world, but the very internal filters that shape your perception. This step changes the relationship with the hidden truth that guides so many silent decisions. It doesn't provide ready-made answers, but opens up a different kind of clarity. A clarity that doesn't come from quick closure, but from continuous observation. And it is at this point that something new begins to form behind the scenes of the mind. If you recognize these signs in yourself, write them in the comments. That makes sense to me. When you start to see all of this working, something curious happens inside. It's not an explosive insight, nor a feeling of, now I understand everything. It's almost the opposite. A silence arises. A different inner space where automatic responses take longer to appear. And this delay, however uncomfortable it may be, carries something very valuable. Because up until now, the brain has always rushed to fill in the gaps. It has always tried to close things off. It has always sought to transform confusion into narrative as quickly as possible. But when you recognize this pattern, the rush diminishes. The mind still wants to explain, still wants to organize, still wants to tell a coherent story, but now there is awareness. And awareness changes the relationship with this impulse. You begin to notice how many of your life decisions stemmed from this same process. Choices made in moments of uncertainty, later supported by stories that gave meaning to what had already been decided. Relationships explained through convenient narratives. Career paths justified by well-organized versions of the past. Even the way you describe yourself to others, and to yourself, carries this same pattern of internal editing. None of this is done with bad intentions. The brain isn't sabotaging you. It's trying to maintain continuity, identity, stability. It wants the journey to make sense. It wants a clear line connecting past, present, and future. The problem arises when that line is built too quickly, without room for revision, without openness to the hidden truth that remains outside. Because every narrative leaves something out. There are always details ignored, emotions unresolved, doubts swept under the rug. There are always points that don't fit perfectly, but are softened so as not to break the story. And the longer this narrative is repeated, the more solid it seems. The more real it becomes. Until questioning it sounds almost like betraying one's own identity. That's where the transformation starts to get delicate. It's not about deconstructing everything, nor about living in permanent doubt. It's about recognizing that many certainties didn't arise from deep understanding, but from the emotional need to move forward. And that changes how you look at yourself. With more kindness, perhaps. With more curiosity. With less rigidity. Your mindset starts to shift. You begin to realize that you don't need to have immediate answers for everything. That maintaining a "I don't know yet" attitude isn't a sign of weakness, but of maturity. That some revelations only emerge when you stop insisting on closing stories too quickly. This internal shift has a real impact. It influences future decisions. It makes choices more conscious. It reduces defensive reactions. It expands the capacity for listening. Not because you become passive, but because you begin to better differentiate between what is real understanding and what is merely a narrative that worked well emotionally. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to realize that many stories from your life don't need to be discarded, just revisited. Viewed from a different angle. With more honesty. With more room for nuance. Some continue to make sense. Others reveal cracks. Others simply dissolve when the confusion that originated them is finally confronted. This process is not comfortable. It demands presence. It demands courage to be left without solid ground for a few moments. It demands accepting that not everything that seems coherent is true, and not all truth comes organized in the form of a story. But it is precisely in this space that something new is built. Not an immediate new narrative, but a different relationship with one's own thinking. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because there comes a point where this mental silence begins to reveal things that were previously suppressed by prepackaged narratives. Old emotions. Decisions never fully understood. Motivations that were rationalized after the fact. When the narrative loosens, the behind-the-scenes aspects emerge. And observing these behind-the-scenes aspects changes the journey. Not dramatically but consistently. You begin to walk with more awareness of what you are choosing, what you are avoiding, what you are explaining just to avoid feeling. Life doesn't become simpler, but it becomes more honest. And inner honesty is a rare kind of clarity. At this point, there is no answer to be given now. There is no conclusion to be reached. Only a question that keeps echoing, creating space, asking for silence before any comfortable explanation can emerge. How many stories from your life make sense? Only because you never stopped to question them. If this question resonated with you, write it in the comments. I'm on this journey too. If you've made it this far, it's because something along the way has touched you. Perhaps an idea, perhaps a discomfort, perhaps a question that hasn't yet found its form. And that says a lot. This kind of content isn't meant to be passed quickly, it's meant to linger and resonate afterward. If this conversation resonated with you, subscribing to the channel is just a simple way to continue this journey with me. The goal here is this: to look behind the scenes of the mind calmly, deeply, and honestly without ready-made answers or easy shortcuts. If this helps you think better, to observe yourself better, it's worth sticking around. If you'd like, leave a comment saying you made it to the end. You can write something simple like, "This message was for me," or, "I'm with you until the end, I read," and that also shows me that this exchange is really happening. And if, at any point during the video you felt that silent connection, that feeling of, "This touched me," leave a like. Not as an automatic click, but as a sign that this kind of reflection has room to exist. There's a video over here that complements this topic and delves even deeper into the idea of how the brain shapes reality without us realizing it. Click and continue reading there. Because, in the end, perhaps the most important thing isn't having all the answers, but start asking the right questions. This is dark human science, where perception is not reality.